everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for another Ashram Talks session. Today, the title of our class is Tuning into Divine Guidance. I really like that title because I think sometimes we associate a spiritual practice or a mindfulness practice with tuning out, right? Or disconnecting from something, turning off, right? We hear that a lot. But for many of us, that spiritual practice may actually have more to do with actually trying to connect and trying to engage meaningfully. So I'm really excited to explore this topic with Abhimanyu again today. We always really appreciate your perspective as, both someone who works professionally with mental health issues, but also someone who is practicing, right? A Bhakti yoga practitioner, someone who has a spiritual practice or a mindfulness practice. So thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you very much, Sienna, for inviting me to speak here. And just, for the audience, I am under the weather right now, so please forgive me if I'm a little stuffed up. I'll begin by offering prayers to invoke that divine guidance in our discussion today so that we can all be enlivened in spiritual life. Sakshad haritvena samasta shastraya ruktastata bhavyata eva sadbi kintu prabhorya priya eva tasya vande guru shri charana ravindam yasya prasadat bhagavat prasado yasya prasadan nagati kutopi dhyayanstu vangstasya yashastri sandhyam vande guru shri charana ravindam vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyeva cha patitanang pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. All right, and so for today's topic of tuning into divine guidance, we have chapter 3, verse 36 of the Bhagavad Gita, where it starts Arjuna Vacha Atakena Prayukto Yang Papang Charati Purushaha Anichannapi Varshneya Balad Ivanayojitaha. Arjuna said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? And the reason I chose this title of Tuning into Divine Guidance is that our primary commentator, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada, he mentions in the purport that although the living entity sometimes does not want to act in sin, he is still forced to act. Sinful actions are not, however, impelled by the supersoul within, but are due to another cause, as the Lord explains in this verse. And so, in the next, the next speaker for Ashram Talks will talk about how, due to the mode of passion, one pursues sinful activities due to lusty desires. But for today's, we're focusing on how, Srila Prabhupada is emphasizing that again, sinful action is not, however, impelled by the supersoul within. And it's a really curious thing. A lot of times, it's almost conventional wisdom. People will tell you, "Oh, just follow your heart, follow your heart." And I remember in my teenage years, my friends and I were taken to see one sannyasi, one monk in the Bhakti yoga tradition. And one of our mentors who was organizing the trip for us, he mentioned something to this monk that, oh yeah, you're supposed to follow your heart. And the sannyasi said, follow your heart. We're supposed to follow sadhu, guru, and shastra. Sadhu meaning saintly persons, guru meaning the spiritual master, and shastra meaning the scriptures. And I've heard other spiritual teachers mention that, if we're following sadhu, guru, and shastra, something feels terribly wrong in our heart. We've probably misunderstood the saintly persons, the spiritual master, and the scriptures. Because the natural result of spiritual life is that we start to have kleshagni. We start to have a relief from our material miseries that make our heart burn. We're meant to have more clarity of mind. I was just reading in a book called Jaiva Dharma that the author explains that ultimately our suffering is created by the perception of our mind, that the way we think about a situation is what actually causes the suffering. And so it's a curious question of tuning into divine guidance. The Srila Prabhupada and our great saintly teachers, they talk about how the super soul is another name for the super soul. Because again, us living entities, we are referred to as Atma, the soul, the spirit soul separate from the body. And then there is the Paramatma. The Upanishads talk about how there are two birds sitting on a tree. One bird is eagerly trying to enjoy the fruits of the tree. The other bird is just witnessing and allowing the first bird to enjoy the fruits of that tree. And so that's an analogy for the soul and the super soul, that us living entities, we're using this body, we're trying to enjoy this world. Our consciousness is going outward through our senses and thus farther away from our spiritual nature, and the super soul is residing inward. He's allowing us. He's the indwelling monitor. He allows us to at least try to enjoy this world, and he either sanctions or doesn't sanction our endeavors to acquire all kinds of objects in this world. And so again, the super soul is waiting there, and he is also referred to as the Chaitya Guru. The Srila Prabhupada calls it the spiritual master as super consciousness, or that the Lord is in our heart, and He is always guiding us at every turn in our life. The super soul is guiding us. The super soul is trying to indicate to us what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, how do we progress in spiritual life. But the unfortunate reality is that due to our externally focused consciousness, our internal vision becomes blurred. The more we're um, sort of holding on to all kinds of attachments and expectations in the external world, the more we're sort of engrossed in materialistic sense gratification, our internal vision, so to speak, becomes dulled, and we become less and less able to discern the voice of the super soul. Because realistically, in the description of the material elements, the subtle body has four elements: there's the mind, the intelligence, the false ego, and the chitta, or the contaminated consciousness. And so we have our own mental chatter going on. Our mind is trying to discriminate between what are we going to accept, what are we going to reject. It's sort of taking in all this information, and it's developing a whole ego around, like, hey, here I am, I want this, I'm this body, I want to enjoy this. And so we have all of these, all this static, so to speak, on the inner television or inner radio, as it were. And Srila Prabhupada in his purports, he will sometimes use the analogy of an inner television, that very pure saintly persons like Sri Sanjaya, who is actually narrating this Bhagavad Gita to Dhritarashtra. Srila Prabhupada talks about um, how Sanjay, because he had, essentially a perfectly clear internal television, he could accurately relay to Dhritarashtra exactly what Arjuna and Krishna were talking about. But again, for ourselves, there's so much static on that internal television. We're clouded by all the subtle material elements. Our mind is focused externally, and so we're less and less likely to be able to hear that guidance of the super soul. And so, in terms of how to tune into that guidance, the acharyas, they, you know, there's, you could say, what was it, the indirect, the negative things, the things that we are meant to give up. The four basic regulative principles, they say, are no illicit sex, meaning no sex life outside of marriage, no eating meat, no intoxication, no gambling. These are four very largely materialistic activities that will get our mind very engrossed um in the outer world. It'll take us out of our inner being, if you will. And so those are, the externals, if you will. And then internally, there are so many practices, especially in this age when we're very busy. Our minds may be disturbed a lot of the time, just because of the world situation tends to become crazier with time rather than saner. And so the main practice for tuning into that divine guidance in this age is the chanting of the holy names and the, you know, vibration of transcendental sound vibrations. Like even this Bhagavad Gita, every one of these verses we're chanting can be considered a mantra, a sound vibration that liberates the mind. And naturally, our acharyas talk about how the Maha Mantra, or great chanting for deliverance in this age, is the Hare Krishna mantra. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Ram Rama, Hare Hare. That the more we chant this holy name in the company of saintly persons, then we start to experience Cheto Darpana Marjanam, the mind, the mirror of the heart and soul, starts to become cleansed by the process of chanting the holy name, and gradually we start to become more aware of our own spiritual nature. We start to sort of separate our identity from first we separate our identity from the external material shell, and then we gradually even start to separate our identity as souls from the inner shell. We start to recognize I'm not my body, I'm not even my mind either, that I'm an eternal spiritual conscious being. And I'm not just a conscious being in a void, but actually, my eternal nature is that of love and service towards that super soul, towards the divine. And so by the process of uttering spiritual sound vibrations and of, you know, first letting go of, as Arjuna is talking about here, sinful acts. And those sinful acts are ultimately the acts that bind the soul more in matter, that entangle us. And in other acharyas' commentaries, they speak about how even a man who is well aware of the Vedic principles, of the rules and regulations, um, he may, you know, they say, he may be tempted towards intoxication, or he may be looking at another person's spouse, even though he's married, things like that, that people can become tempted like that because even though they're aware of those regulative principles, still, our mind and senses tend to go outward, and so we start contemplating the objects of those senses. And as it's said in the second chapter, the more we contemplate the objects of the senses, we become attached to them, and from there, the desire to enjoy them for ourselves arises within our heart. And so the acharyas, they explain that we cannot stop contemplating, we cannot stop, being, we cannot stop desiring fully. And so they give us a process by which we can start to desire spiritually. That by chanting the holy name, by hearing about the pastimes of Sri Krishna from the lips of pure devotees, then we have a new object for positive desire, an object for spiritual life. And at that point, our spiritual life, we're not chanting just to resolve any material agony or misery, or to resolve any cumbersome situation in this world, but um, eventually it switches to where, okay, initially I'm suffering in this world. Suffering leads me to inquire, atata brahma jigyasa, what is the absolute truth? Who am I? Why am I suffering? And so then we start to engage in spiritual life to mitigate our suffering as we navigate the material world. And then gradually, the mentality flips to where, no, I'm not engaging in spiritual life just to mitigate my material situation. Now I'm engaging in my material life, and I'm trying to sustain this body and soul together so that I can continue my spiritual life, so that I can continue hearing and chanting about Krishna, because this is where the nectar of life is, so to speak. This is where we actually find uh, the divine pleasure we're looking for. What was it? Amritasya Putra. I think that was one of the Vedic aphorisms saying that, O Jiva, O spirit soul, you're ultimately born of nectar, and it's back to nectar that you need to go. The fact that you're searching for ananda or bliss is a sign that you have that sense of ananda or bliss inherent within your very soul. It said Satchit Ananda. We're eternal. Um, the soul is inherently full of knowledge because we're parts of Krishna, and the soul has the potential to be full of bliss. And because we have that seed within us, we keep searching for it. We keep searching for enjoyment. And again, the Bhagavad Gita, the acharyas who both live and teach the Bhagavad Gita, they give a positive process by which we can start to experience that happiness actually, within the core of our heart. And so yeah, as far as tuning into that divine guidance goes, things like mindfulness, they can definitely have, they can definitely have their use in that. Especially if we know now I'm speaking a little bit more from the secular mental health perspective, that if we already know that we say have certain compulsive behaviors or addictive behaviors, naturally, if we notice that our mind is saying, trying to justify these dysfunctional behaviors, we can start to develop the mindfulness. So, okay, this is my mind talking. This is my compulsion talking. And, this compulsive behavior is how I've been, well, I don't even know what it is I've been using this to cope with, because I've been so immersed in this habit that as soon as discomfort arises, I run to my habit. And that could be, for some people that's substance abuse, for some people that's phone time, for some people it's overeating, there are so many things one can become addicted to. But the common feature is that, yeah, usually when there's, you know, some uncomfortable emotions internally, something, or maybe some external situation we'd rather not face, then we sort of go to our pacifiers. We go to our compulsive behaviors to make ourselves feel better. But then we get in this cycle where we're doing things to make ourselves feel better without addressing our underlying needs, and it's unmet needs that make us feel bad in the first place. So we do the compulsive behavior, the bad feelings go down, but our needs are still not unmet, so now the bad feelings just become worse, and then we have to engage in the compulsive behavior harder to try and feel just as good as we did before, but the needs are still not met, so then the fire just keeps going down a little bit and then going higher, going down a little bit and then going higher. And so this is how deep anxiety can build. This is how addictions can build. And so, mindfulness can definitely have its place in sort of recognizing where our, maybe where our lower nature is using escapes to escape from responsibilities of our life, escape from uh, difficult realities of our life. And so, yeah, as part of tuning into divine guidance is being willing to let go of our little pacifiers and escapes and be open to actually, you know, questioning, okay, for whatever it is that I'm suffering with, for whatever it is that my mind is in such distress about, what alternate truth could be there? There's a famous verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Tatenu kampam susamikshmano bunjana evatma kritang vipakam redavagva purbir vidadhan namaste jivete yomukti pade sadaya bhak. It's many Vaishnavas, many saintly persons talk about always wearing this verse very close to our chest. um, Tattenu kampam susamikshmano. This word susamikshmano, I've actually heard from my spiritual master. He explains that susamikshmano in Sanskrit means to very thoroughly and minutely analyze a situation. That whenever we're going through some suffering, we need to very carefully analyze the situation, analyze our thinking about it, with the end goal of finding tattenu kampam, the end goal of finding that somehow or other in this situation the Supreme Lord is actually being merciful. He's actually showing me an act of compassion by this situation. Um, and so this, whenever suffering comes our way in life, whenever calamities, things come out of left field, and our whatever blueprint we had for how the year was supposed to go, for how our life was supposed to go, sometimes something comes along in life and shatters whatever blueprint we had. And so this verse talks about how, again, the suffering from those events, it's not so much from the event externally that happened, but it's our thinking about the event, that this wasn't supposed to happen. This never should have happened. And because we're holding on to that thinking, this shouldn't have happened, and I'm not going to be able to handle it, then we start to feel dread, anxiety, grief, anger, maybe even rage, depending on the situation. And so it's the thoughts that, okay, well, it's not supposed to be this way. And, for many people, that then turns into a questioning of the divine, of God himself, that how could you do this to me? How could you do this to us? How could you allow this to happen? And the assumption is that if there is a God, he's being cruel. And so the challenge for the transcendentalist, for the devotee, is to very carefully analyze the situations of our life, knowing that fundamentally, ontologically, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, he is known as Karunamai. He is full of compassion. And this is all, a lot of this is explained in the book Jaiva Dharma in chapter 16, that, when Rajanath was asking one Babaji Maharaj about, essentially, why does the living entity suffer in this world? Babaji Maharaj explained that fundamentally, Bhagavan, he is both Karunamai and Leelamai. Karunamai meaning full of compassion, compassionate by nature, and Leelamai meaning that he is full of many, many wonderful pastimes, and he's always looking to engage in a loving relationship with us out of compassion. And so everything, even the difficulties we go through in life, are ultimately meant to help us come closer to our divine eternal relationship with Sri Krishna. And sometimes that may be accomplished by us having our desires fulfilled, and sometimes that's accomplished by, Krishna not allowing our desires to be fulfilled. And again, the acharyas guide us that again, the ontological truth is that Krishna is always being merciful, that he is the embodiment of all bliss. And so therefore anything he does for us is meant to bring us to the platform of highest bliss. And it's up to us to find out, how is this situation meant to elevate me to being more blissful, to being more, more Krishna conscious. And so the more the spiritualist very carefully looks at the situations of their life and the actively finds out how the Lord is being compassionate, and recognizes that ultimately the difficulties in my life are due to my own previous sinful reactions, due to my own previous misdeeds, either in this life or a previous life. Now I'm being given situations that are, that are unpleasant. Um, and with this mentality, Hridvagva Purbir Vidadhan Namaste, always with, was it Hridvagva, with one's heart, with one's words, and with one's body. Excuse me.
Yeah, of course.
But yes, Hridvagva Purbir, with one's heart, with one's words, with one's body, always, holding a mood of humility, of surrender to the Lord. Um, Jivetiyo Mukti Pade Sadayabak, one ultimately attains the lotus feet of Mukunda, who not only grants freedom from the sufferings of this material world, but it said his face is very beautiful like a kunda flower. And so it is by by having sort of this attitude of gratitude ultimately. And again, it's not an artificial sense of gratitude. It's not a sort of a surface level positive thinking, but it's going in very deeply, ultimately into our own heart, to correct our way of thinking that leads us to suffer, that leads us to go away from that divine guidance, that leads us to not recognize the Lord's compassion on us. That is what, you know, you know, that kind of thinking, the more we come out of that, then we can start to tune into divine guidance. We can start to recognize that the Lord is actually being very kind, very sweet, and very compassionate within us. And even if our blueprint for a certain part of our life may have been shattered, we can become open minded to see, okay, well, Sri Krishna, he didn't have planned what I had planned, but what does this open up for me? And so yeah, those are the main things that come to mind for me when I think of tuning into divine guidance. And in summary, you know that's eliminating certain, you could say, sinful activities from our life: illicit sex, intoxication, gambling, eating flesh, um, and then actively engaging in spiritual practices in the company of other spiritualists, other devotees, of chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, of hearing the pastimes of Krishna in the association of devotees, of studying scriptures like Bhagavad Gita in this association of devotees. And so we gradually start to um, come alive and come in tune with the guidance that the super soul is giving in our heart, because ultimately that guidance that the Lord is giving us, it will be aligned with what the scriptures, what the saintly persons, and what the spiritual master teaches us. And so when we can find it in our heart to recognize the value that's there in the scriptures, the words of the spiritual master and the words of saintly persons, then we can know that we are in line with that divine guidance. And so with that, I will pause here for now. Are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, we have some nice comments from Colleen today. Thank you again for joining us, Colleen. And, without taking up too much time, I think typically, I don't know, in religious context, right, when we hear about things that are maybe like prohibited, it almost seems, people perceive this as really negative, right? Or almost as kind of one dimensional, right? Like just don't do this. But I think in Krishna consciousness, like there's kind of a deeper reality behind that. And, I like that you highlighted in terms of the regulative principles, these are activities that are not beneficial to us, right? Especially if we're looking at maybe clarifying or gaining, some control and clarity of the mind, right? As a first step, or kind of to open that door to a spiritual practice, these are activities that don't help us in that, right? So I think we think a lot about, people hear these things like not doing these things or not being allowed to do
Right.
these things. But I like that you kind of framed that as, these are really tools that are designed to help us and to create an environment where this type of progress is going to be easier.
Yes, yes, and that's exactly why the sort of almost cliched advice of just follow your heart can sometimes be terrible advice, because sometimes, again, depending on previous condition, depending on cultural messages we've gotten, we might think our heart is telling us to do something that's going to put us in a really regrettable situation. If somebody's accustomed to drinking, they'll feel like, well, my heart's telling me that I need a drink. If somebody has a gambling habit, they'll feel, okay, well, my heart is telling me that, this time I'm going to win it all back. Um, or, if somebody, and I mean, the list goes on, but basically, yeah, depending on our previous conditioning, if our heart is accustomed to doing things that are not beneficial for our spiritual life, then the follow your heart advice, can just take us farther and farther away from our real purpose in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for providing some clarity there. I also left in the comments, and I'll put in the comments to the video, we have a whole session that we did previously about kind of framing sin in the Vedic context, right? It's a really kind of a charged word with a lot of negative connotation, but we have a whole session where we kind of explore this a little bit more. So again, I'll put that in the comments if anyone is kind of interested in looking more into that. But thank you again so much for joining us, Abhimanyu, and we really appreciate your discussion today.
Thank you so much. Hare Krishna.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Feel free to subscribe so that you continue to be notified about all of our classes as we, continue to explore the Gita verse by verse. But we look forward to seeing you again Monday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. See you soon.